G'day guys and gal. The answer to the question, who is the most powerful Primarch, is incredibly difficult to answer as it really depends on the context. In a dark, ambushy area, Conrad and Corax would body the rest. In an open field with no ceiling, Sanguinius would tear his brothers to shreds. From 50 kilometers away, no one stands a chance against Peter Turbo. They all have their clear strengths and weaknesses, with the Emperor not coming extra hard in one test tube compared to another, except maybe Sanguinius, but that's besides the point. However, measuring their physical strength is a lot easier, with there being a very clear tier system for the physical strength of the Primarchs. So I thought let's look at the 5 strongest and weakest Primarchs to see who has the girthiest squat, bench and deadlift, and who would get bitch slapped, or has been bitch slapped for being a weak-ass demigod. Before we get started, I am very excited to announce the launch of the Majorkill Christmas merch drop. This drop features 4 new original designs available in both t-shirt and singlet form, including the Midnight Clad design, Flesh is Weak design, the Sacrifice design, and Nothing to Lose design. Now, unfortunately, the samples that were sent to me were actually stolen during transit by one of you cheeky fucks. I respect it, but it also means I don't have them to show off right now, which is super annoying. However, they are made of the same material and print quality of the previous merch drop, including this t-shirt. If you've gotten Majorkill merch before, you know the quality is elite, with me always choosing a nicely cut t-shirt so if you lift, people can tell, and if you don't, then people can't. Speaking of this t-shirt, we also have some of our older merch designs available in very small quantities as a part of our legacy range. So if you've missed out and like some of the older designs, then here's your chance. As the icing on the cake, we are bringing back the massively popular fuckhead Santa hats, alongside the first 200 orders also getting a free Majorkill Stocking. That's a $20 item for free, so now is the best time to pick something up, especially to make sure you get it before Christmas. I'm a huge fan of this drop, especially the Midnight Clad design, which actually comes in midnight blue. Link is below. Today we'll go over the 5 strongest and weakest Primarchs, starting at the 5th weakest, then going 5th strongest, and then working our way to the top. I'll be discussing the Primarchs before Demonic Ascension to make life a bit easier. Let's get into it. Starting us off with the 5th weakest Primarch is Fulgrim. Now before you shit blood and cum piss, hear me out. Fulgrim was known for finesse, parrying and countering, speed and skill. He never really applied overwhelming strength and was often described as very lithe and slender for a Primarch. He only really started getting strong when he picked up the Layer Blade and borrowed the raw power of a demon, which as we have said, we aren't counting. When Fulgrim and Ferris fought, Fulgrim won because Ferris used a move that would have worked if Fulgrim was as strong as he was normally. It only failed due to Fulgrim drawing the strength from the demon, surprising Ferris with his power, which then allowed him to go for the killing strike. Just because he's the 5th weakest doesn't make Fulgrim weak, especially compared to the 4 below him, but until he got all demonic and shit, our boy was not out-muscling his brothers. Now for our 5th strongest, we have Leman Russ, the Wolf Daddy himself. Leman was considered to be one of the most powerful warriors out of all of his brothers, despite having a pretty mid-track record when it came to dueling the other Primarchs. While a big part of this was due to his strength, after all the dude was a fucking Viking, it was more so his ferocity and aggression, which is why he isn't higher up on this list. Sure, he picked up Magnus and snapped his spine over his knee, but if you look at the physical strength of the Primarchs, all of them could have technically done it. Leman just had the ferocity to fight Magnus down and create the opening for him to bane the shit out of him. It was this same ferocity that allowed him to overcome Horus and have him at his mercy, as well as establish the Space Wolves as the Emperor's executioners. So whilst Leman wasn't the strongest of his brothers, his total reliance on his physical power puts him in the top 5. Now for the 4th weakest of the Primarchs, we have Alfarius. Alfarius was 2 parts of a whole, not quite a half Primarch, but not a full Primarch either, as evident by Rogaldorn killing him in a fair duel, as well as a squad of mortal Lucifer Blacks being strong enough to allow one of them to stab Alfarius. Alfarius' entire game was scheming, subterfuge, manipulation, a dagger in the shadows. He never showed any particular signs of strength and was the shortest of the Primarchs. In saying that, as he didn't have any psychic ability and he relied entirely on his physical prowess, he wasn't the physically weakest of his brothers. Not to mention, he wasn't afraid of getting his hands dirty in melee combat if needed, such as his quick duel with Constantine Valdor, a warrior who was considered to be a Primarch tier in combat ability. So whilst Alfarius definitely isn't going to win a punch on with most of his brothers, he also wasn't the weakest. For the 4th strongest, we now have Horus. Horus was an immense Primarch, very bulky and very famed for his overwhelming force and power. After all, the dude literally wielded a gigantic mace and a power talon, two very aggressive melee weapons. When Horus depowered himself to fight Sanguinius' equals, Sanguinius would rely on his speed, doing hit and run strategies, whilst Horus was this slower juggernaut who hit harder and could take more hits, but couldn't match Sangi's speed or finesse. Horus was always more of a jack of all trades, did everything well but nothing the best, so while he was a tough, strong motherfucker, he isn't able to crack the top 3. On to the top 3 now. We have the third weakest Primarch being Lorgar. Sure, I give Lorgar a lot of shit for being a weak little bitch, but a lot of that is due to his poor fighting ability and low power. His physical strength is actually not completely trash, but as he spent so long trying not to be a warrior, he was never really able to develop it or his combat ability. However, he is still pretty weak. When he slammed his mace into Guilliman's face, sure it tore half of it off, but G-Man barely even registered it, and his uppercut to Lorgar's chest launched Lorgar back and broke his sternum. In all of Lorgar's fights with Corvus, it ends badly. When Corvus impaled Lorgar, Lorgar began headbutting Corvus, and while it broke his nose, the Raven Lord didn't even flinch. Lorgar's supposed power boost during the heresy was purely psychic, and it wasn't even that great. When he tried to betray Horus and become the new War Master, it only took one hit from Horus's mace to fuck Lorgar up and end his coup. Time and time again, Lorgar has shown himself to be a poor warrior, and a large part of that is him being pretty fucking weak, but surprisingly, not the weakest. On the flip side, the third strongest Primarch is Angron. We all know Angron's famous feat of holding up the Warhound Titan's foot, which is pretty fucking insane. But when you also consider the fact that he was considered to be one of the most vicious and powerful Primarchs in melee combat, despite the brain nails and losing his Primarch aura, then his strength goes to a new level. Angron has been buried in tons of rubble multiple times, only to then dig his way out. All of his fights against his brothers, at least before he became a demon, ended with an Angron win, knocking Leman on his ass, battering Guilliman down. These feats were all achieved with overwhelming force and a lot of strength. The nails basically allow Angron to overclock, putting extra strain on his body whilst allowing him to tap into an even deeper well of strength. It honestly feels like mortal Angron was stronger than demon Angron. However, mortal Angron also would have had his brain melted by now, so can't really blame him too much. Regardless of how spazzy his power is, you can't say the boy isn't strong. Now for the second weakest Primarch. This one may surprise you considering how fucking jacked his model and artwork is, but it's actually Magnus the Red. Dude used these psychic powers to give himself glamour muscles. Magnus is a large, jacked Primarch, but he is also so reliant on his warp powers that his actual physical power is trash. Whenever someone overcomes his warp powers or nullifies them, he's fucked. Once Leman had closed the gap with Magnus, he was able to overpower him and snap his spine. Even Demon Magnus is pretty weak, with Guilliman punching the shit out of him once the Sisters of Silence arrived to cut Magnus off from the warp. Magnus once dueled a Space Wolf chapter master and was genuinely having a rough time of it, as he wasn't using his psychic powers at the time. Probably the best example of his weakness was when the Lion was fighting a shape-shifting warp creature that took on the different forms of his brothers. When it changed into Magnus and punched him, the Lion remarked that he knew for a fact that the creature wasn't Magnus, as Magnus could never punch that hard. A final example is Magnus vs Vulcan. When Vulcan was able to survive Magnus's super mega death attack, because you know, it's Vulcan, he beat Magnus to death, no worries. Those glamour muscles, man. Speaking of Vulcan, we have him at the number 2 spot for strongest Primarchs. Vulcan was an absolute beast, the largest of his brothers and easily one of the strongest. Some examples of his strength include his weapon of choice being a gigantic warhammer, him holding up tons and tons of rock slab for many hours when he was held prisoner by Conrad Curse, beating Conrad Curse in a fight despite being unarmored, close to insanity and wounded, whilst Conrad was in full armor and fresh, winning that fight mostly because of how insanely strong he was. During the Isfahan Dropsite massacre, Vulcan was a literal one-man army, charging the Iron Warriors' gun line, tanking all their shots, and when he reached it, he began smacking tanks around like they were baseballs. The only way to stop his rampage was to drop a low-yield tactical nuke on his ass, which still didn't put him down as the traitors then had to bum rush him and stab him to death, which as we know he also survived. Now I can definitely appreciate that a lot of people put Vulcan at the strongest, and I wouldn't fault you for doing so, however just hear me out for my strongest pick first. But before that, now for the weakest of all Primarchs. we have Conrad Curse. This one might surprise you considering how well Conrad does in Primarch fights, holding off G-Man at the line at the same time, Sanguinius not wanting to fight him because he was unsure who would win, beating the line in a brawl and only not killing him because a Dark Angel stabbed him in the spine. But here's the thing, none of Conrad's power comes from his strength. He's actually very weak and relies on his speed, Primarch powers, and foresight to be so deadly. Fighting Conrad is like fighting the shadows. When he was first unleashed on McCrag, he had a difficult time killing a particularly large Ultramarine captain, and then when he fought Alexis Pollux, a Space Marine so large that it unnerved Guilliman, he was actually getting his ass beat for a lot of the fight due to Pollux getting help from Dantioch, thus knowing where Conrad would be. Conrad genuinely struggled to overpower him. When Vulcan, unarmored, beat the shit out of an armored Conrad, Vulcan specifically said that all the Primarchs saw him as the weakest, and that Vulcan held back when they would spar back in the day because he didn't want to hurt him. When finally put in a fair fight against the Lion was able to overcome his spazziness and cleanly beat Conrad. You may argue that Conrad overcoming the Lion in a brawl and choking him shows that he is strong, but the Lion was never known for his strength, and getting the upper hand in a grapple, a form of fighting Conrad excels in and the Lion avoids, doesn't depend much on strength. In my Jiu-Jitsu class, there's a really good, really small purple belt girl who is an absolute nightmare to fight against, but in terms of strength, I'm easily like 4 to 5 times stronger than her. It would be a similar situation here, but with the Lion only being like 40% stronger instead of 400% or more. Just goes to show that strength isn't everything when it comes to power. Now for the strongest of all the Primarchs, which might surprise you since he died the fastest, but it is none other than Ferrus Manus. Ferrus Manus grew up punching on with all the nightmares his world had to offer. He literally wrestled a giant Necron construct and held it in lava until it died, giving him his silver living metal arms, which then only increased his strength further. When the Emperor came to Medusa, he and Ferrus literally had an anime tier wrestling match for Ferrus to join him. Entire mountains were leveled during this punch-on. Going back to his duel with Fulgrim, the move Ferrus did, a move that left Ferrus open to a counterattack, was done because he was so confident in his strength advantage over Fulgrim. He just wasn't aware that Fulgrim had a demon up his ass juicing him up. With Ferrus dying so early, we don't get to see many of his feats of strength compared to his brothers, but he was universally admired on both sides. Horus said the heresy would be a cakewalk if the Iron Hands were on his side, with Guilliman naming Ferrus amongst the most powerful Primarchs. As for why I believe Ferrus to be stronger than Vulcan, despite pretty much every Reddit post and discussion having Vulcan as number 1, is because it's mostly taken from their older pre-heresy feats. Ferrus leveled mountains in his contest with the Emperor. Vulcan couldn't even lift a fire salamander and pull himself up from the tip of a volcano at the same time. Ferrus was like this figure of myth, a genuine Hercules, and I did actually read that Forge World once stated that Ferrus Manus was the physically strongest Primarch, even more so than Vulcan. So if this list has taught us anything, it's that strength isn't everything when it comes to power. If you enjoyed the video and you want to support the channel, then pick up some Majorkill Christmas merch. Remember, first 200 orders get a free Majorkill Stocking. Hit the subscribe button and hit the real subscribe button for more strong content. Join the Discord for more memes and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.